I was an infantryman with the British Expeditionary Force. Spring, 1940. Western Front, Northern France. At that time, we didn't call it the front line yet. It was just a temporary position between quiet villages and open fields, places that still looked like they belonged to peacetime. The sky felt too wide, too calm for what was coming. The war, then, was still something distant, something spoken about, not yet lived. We arrived at night. The trains stopped without announcements, lights were cut before we could see the station signs. Everything was done quietly, as if silence itself were a form of protection. I kept a folded letter from my mother in my breast pocket. I didn't read it for meaning anymore. I read it for familiarity, for the shape of the words. They reminded me that there had been a world before uniforms and orders. Our officers spoke plainly. No speeches. No promises. Just routines, guard shifts, digging schedules, weapon checks. They told us to keep our heads down and our mouths shut. I remember realizing then that fear wasn't loud. Fear didn't shout or shake. It waited. It settled into the body and stayed there. The uniform felt stiff and wrong, still carrying the smell of storage rooms and oil. My rifle was heavier than I expected, awkward in my hands. I practiced holding it the way they showed us, trying to treat it like a tool, something neutral. But at night, standing watch, the metal grew cold faster than my thoughts. Every sound carried weight. Wind moving through hedges. A distant engine. Footsteps that turned out to be nothing. Everything felt like a warning. We dug in even though no one said an attack was imminent. The soil was damp, stubborn, clinging to the shovel. I worked without speaking, counting movements, letting repetition calm me. On either side of me were men I barely knew, clerks, factory workers, shop assistants, now soldiers because history had decided so. We talked about tea. About food. About anything small enough not to frighten us. No one mentioned death. No one needed to. Evenings were the worst. That was when the waiting grew heavy. No gunfire. No alarms. Just a sense that something was approaching, slowly and without concern for our readiness. Officers passed through more often. Radios stayed quiet. When I lay down to sleep, clouds moved low across the sky, thick and gray, like smoke without fire. I watched them and thought that war was mostly this, long stretches of anticipation, broken only by imagination. The first days passed with little action. We studied maps we barely understood, listened to reports that spoke in generalities. Lines moved. Towns changed hands. None of it felt real. What felt real was the tension in my chest, the constant awareness of being exposed. I wasn't afraid of dying, not exactly. I was afraid of disappearing. Of becoming lost in a retreat, forgotten between orders, left somewhere no one would return to. That thought stayed with me more than anything else. Being left behind. It wasn't something anyone said aloud, but it was there, unspoken, in every glance exchanged during roll calls. We all sensed how easily it could happen. A delayed movement. A broken vehicle. A wrong turn in the dark. One morning, a low fog covered the fields, dulling sound and shrinking distance. I stood at the edge of the trench, staring into the gray, and felt the war enter me without violence. It came through silence, through the smell of wet earth, through the pauses between commands. Nothing had happened yet. And still, something had already changed. I didn't know then how quickly waiting would give way to chaos. I only knew that once it did, there would be no room left for hesitation. And if we were ever abandoned, it wouldn't be dramatic. It would happen quietly. And the hardest part would be standing there, alone, realizing the world had moved on without you. The first shots didn't come with a warning. There was no speech, no signal flare cutting the sky. Just a sudden, distant thump that rolled through the ground before the sound reached our ears. At first, I thought it was thunder. Then another followed, closer this time, and the earth around us seemed to tense, as if it recognized the noise before we did. Orders came quickly after that. Helmets on. Rifles ready. Stay in position. The calm routine of the previous days collapsed into fragments of shouted instructions and hurried movements. I remember fumbling with my gear, hands clumsy despite weeks of drills. Training teaches you what to do. It doesn't prepare you for how your body reacts when it finally starts. Artillery began falling beyond the fields, dull flashes behind the tree line. The sound was constant now, a heavy rhythm that erased silence completely. Each explosion felt closer than the last, even when it wasn't. Dirt rattled against the sides of the trench. Somewhere to my left, someone was breathing too fast. I couldn't tell if it was me. When the shells started landing nearer, instinct took over. I pressed myself into the earth, face against the damp wall of the trench. The smell was sharp, mud, smoke, cordite carried by the wind. I had imagined battle as something visible, something you could face. Instead, most of it was unseen. Noise without direction. Violence without shape. Then came the small arms fire. Short bursts at first, probing, as if the enemy was testing the ground. Bullets cracked overhead, snapping through branches, striking soil with flat, ugly sounds. I raised my rifle when ordered, aiming at movement I couldn't clearly see. Shapes between hedgerows. Shadows where men might be. I fired because I was told to, because everyone else was firing, because not firing felt more dangerous than pulling the trigger. Time lost its structure. Minutes stretched, then vanished entirely. I remember reloading, again and again, hands working automatically. I remember shouting, though I don't remember what I said. The trench filled with smoke and dust, making it hard to breathe, harder to think. Somewhere nearby, a man screamed once and then went silent. No one reacted. There was no space left for shock. What struck me most wasn't the chaos, it was how quickly my expectations died. I had imagined courage would feel like resolve, like clarity. Instead, it felt mechanical. Narrow. Reduced to the next action, load, aim, fire, wait. The war stripped everything else away. There was no room for ideals, no time for fear to fully form. Fear was there, constant, but pushed aside by necessity. At some point, the firing eased. Not stopped, just thinned, like rain turning to drizzle. Orders filtered down the line, confused and incomplete. We were to hold. Then prepare to move. Then wait. I checked the faces around me. Mud-streaked, eyes wide, expressions hollowed out by exhaustion that had arrived far too early. I realized then that the war wasn't a single moment of terror. It was erosion. Each hour wore something away: confidence, certainty, the sense of who I had been before. By the time darkness crept back over the fields, I felt older than I had that morning. And I understood that whatever this war was going to be, it would not leave us unchanged. Even if we survived the day, something essential had already been taken. The moment everything broke apart came during the retreat. By then, the idea of a front line no longer meant anything. Positions shifted by the hour, sometimes faster. Roads clogged with units moving in opposite directions, orders passed down already outdated. We were told to fall back to a new defensive line before dawn. Simple enough. That's what they always said. We moved at night, across open ground cut by hedgerows and shallow ditches. No lights. No talking. Just the sound of boots sinking into wet soil and the distant growl of artillery chasing us from behind. I stayed near the middle of the column, close enough to hear the man in front of me breathing, close enough to feel the presence of others. That mattered more than I realized. The shelling started without warning. Not scattered fire this time, concentrated, deliberate. Explosions walked across the field with purpose, each one closer than the last. Someone shouted to spread out, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness collapsed into noise and fire. Men dropped instinctively, others ran, breaking formation in seconds. Discipline vanished. Survival took its place. I threw myself into a shallow depression just as a shell landed nearby. The blast lifted the ground, slammed it back down. My ears rang, sharp and hollow, as if the world had been drained of sound. When I tried to get up, my legs didn't respond. For a moment, I thought I was paralyzed. Then the pain arrived, hot and immediate, tearing through my side. I lay there, half buried in mud, watching shapes move past me. Boots. Shadows. Men running low, rifles clutched tight. I tried to shout, but my voice came out weak, swallowed by the noise. Another explosion flared white against the night, and I lost sight of them completely. By the time the shelling moved on, the field was empty. The silence afterward was worse than the bombardment. No commands. No movement. Just distant fire and the sound of my own breathing, uneven and shallow. I dragged myself toward the nearest hedgerow, every movement tearing at my side. My hand came away wet when I pressed it there. I didn't need to look to know what that meant. Dawn came slowly, gray and indifferent. Smoke hung low over the fields, blurring everything into the same lifeless color. I waited for someone to come back. Medics. A patrol. Anyone. Minutes passed. Then hours. Nothing. That was when it became clear. They hadn't fallen back just past the field. They were gone. The unit had moved on, forced to leave the wounded behind or unaware I was still alive. There was no anger in the realization. Just a deep, hollow understanding. This was how it happened. Not through betrayal. Not through choice. Through necessity. I lay there, listening to the distant war continue without me. Tanks rumbled somewhere far off. Aircraft passed overhead, unseen. The world was still moving, still fighting. And I was alone, pressed into the mud, reduced to waiting again, this time not for orders, but for fate. That was the moment the war truly changed for me. Not when the shells fell. Not when the blood soaked into the ground. But when I understood that survival could depend on nothing more than whether someone noticed you were missing. And sometimes, no one did. The battlefield didn't look like a battlefield once the fighting moved on. Without the noise, without the movement, it felt abandoned in a way that was almost peaceful. Smoke drifted low across the fields, thin and gray, blurring the edges of everything. The ground was torn open in shallow scars, as if the earth itself had been clawed apart and left to rest. I don't know how long I lay there before I managed to move again. Time had lost any clear meaning. The pain in my side had dulled into something heavy and constant, a pressure that reminded me I was still alive. Each breath felt measured, deliberate. I learned quickly that panic only made it worse. I pulled myself closer to the hedgerow and stayed there, half hidden, watching the sky change color as the day went on. Flies gathered. I waved them away when I could, too tired to care when I couldn't. The smell was everywhere, burned metal, churned soil, something sweet and wrong that I tried not to identify. It settled into my clothes, into my lungs. At some point, I heard voices. Distant at first. I froze, every muscle tight, unsure which side they belonged to. Fear returned sharply then, not the broad fear of battle, but something more focused. The fear of being found by the wrong people. I stayed still, barely breathing, until the voices faded and the field returned to silence. Lying there, I began to think about the men who had been with me. Not in detail, faces came and went, but in fragments. A laugh from the trench. A shared cigarette. Someone complaining about the weight of their pack. Those small things felt more real now than the fighting itself. They were proof that I hadn't imagined the time before this. My body felt emptied out. Not just from blood, but from effort. From holding myself together long enough to matter. I wasn't brave anymore. I wasn't afraid either. I was simply exhausted, in a way that went deeper than muscle or bone. The war had taken something I couldn't name, and I wasn't sure it would ever give it back. As the light began to fade again, a light rain started to fall. It cooled my skin, washed some of the grime from my face. I welcomed it, not because it helped, but because it reminded me that the world still worked as it always had. Weather didn't care about wars. It arrived on schedule, indifferent and precise. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. When I woke, the field looked the same, just darker, quieter. I was still there. Still alive. Still alone. The realization settled over me slowly, without drama. Whatever happened next, I would face it by myself. That night, lying among the ruins of a battle already forgotten by those who survived it, I understood something clearly for the first time. Being left behind wasn't just a moment. It was a condition. A state you entered when the war moved forward and you couldn't follow. And once you were there, everything became smaller, pain, hope, even fear, until all that remained was endurance. I was found 2 days later. Not by my unit, not by anyone who knew my name, but by a patrol moving carefully through ground that no longer mattered. They spoke to me first, slowly, their voices cautious, as if I might disappear if they raised them. By then, I had stopped expecting anything. Being discovered felt less like rescue and more like interruption. They carried me out on a stretcher that smelled of old canvas and disinfectant. As we moved, I watched the field slide past in fragments, broken fence posts, torn earth, a helmet half buried in mud. I wondered how many men had been left in places like that, never found, absorbed quietly back into the land. I understood then how thin the line was between being remembered and being erased. Recovery was not heroic. There were no clear moments of triumph, only long hours of stillness. A field hospital, dimly lit, crowded with men who looked older than they were. Some cried out in their sleep. Others stared at the ceiling as if it might explain something. I listened more than I spoke. Pain became routine. So did the absence of news. The war continued, of course. It always did. Dates changed. Names of towns shifted across maps pinned to walls. Sometimes I heard rumors of evacuations, of defeats, of stubborn resistance. None of it felt connected to me anymore. The war had moved on, and I was left in its wake, marked but no longer central to it. When I was finally declared fit enough to be transferred, I felt no relief. Only distance. Distance from the man I had been before northern France, before the retreat, before the moment I realized no one was coming back for me. I had survived, but survival felt like a technicality rather than a victory. I never rejoined the same unit. By the time I was ready, they were gone, scattered, reorganized, or buried. I carried their absence with me in quiet ways. In the way I avoided crowds. In how silence no longer comforted me, but demanded attention. In how I watched doors, exits, always measuring how quickly I could leave. The war did not end for me when the fighting slowed or when victory was finally declared years later. It ended gradually, in pieces. In moments when I realized I no longer remembered certain faces clearly. When the sound of distant thunder no longer made my hands shake. When the idea of being left behind stopped feeling exceptional and started feeling familiar. I think often about that field. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. It was the place where the war stripped itself of noise and revealed what remained underneath. Fragility. Chance. The quiet way lives diverge and are forgotten. They left me behind, yes. But not out of cruelty. Not out of indifference. They left me because the war allowed no room for pause. Understanding that didn't heal anything, but it gave the experience shape. It made it something I could carry without being crushed by it. I lived through the rest of the war with that knowledge. That survival isn't always about moving forward. Sometimes it's about staying still long enough to be found. And sometimes, it's about accepting that being left behind changes you in ways no victory ever could.